Hey, welcome to episode 84 of Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Freeman. I'm a professional speaker who ironically has a speech impediment. One of the things I love to talk about is the power of doing our imperfect best. And what I mean by that is we develop a version of the best we're striving for in our minds, and then when imperfections come up, we use those imperfections as impetus to move forward. And sometimes, as my guest today illustrates and exemplifies, the idea of best expands exponentially because of the imperfections we've had to endure. So with that, see you in a minute. Nope. Well, that was dramatic if it had worked. With that, see you in a
Today's guest, Roger Cheetham.
Roger. As a multi-award winning international TEDx speaker, resilience coach, and mental health advocate, Roger describes one of his proudest moments as the moment, check this out, that he took the that he made the definite decision to turn his own extreme adversities from a negative, which happened to him, into a positive, which happened for the many thousands around the world. He has used his experiences to help. I get goosebumps just reading that. And as you get to know Roger, I predict you'll have goosebumps too. In coaching others to find the resilience within themselves. I love that. To find the resilience within themselves. Roger has helped them keep going through difficult times, bounce back from hard times, and spring forward to experience greater times than they ever imagined possible. Through his work, Roger has brought hope, inspiration, and success to individuals and organizations from classrooms to boardrooms across the world, and has recently founded a not-for-profit social enterprise. And I love this name. The enterprise is called Survive, Strive, Thrive. This organization meets young people where they're at with the adversity they're facing in life, works with them to overcome and move on from these and go forward to live the life they truly deserve. With that, please help me welcome Roger Cheetham. Hey, Roger, welcome. Can you hear me? Why can't I hear you? Okay, now talk. Roger, hmm. Life presents small. Oh, Roger.
Anything now?
Yeah.
Yeah, people wouldn't, your listeners wouldn't believe, would they, Jason, that we actually just spent 15 minutes checking cameras, microphones, and everything worked fine. But I guess bang on cue there, we were testing the resilience of ourselves to deal with that very situation.
There's definitely opportunities for resilience in the like almost a microscopically small things like a mic not working, and then in the really large things too. Is isn't there?
Indeed, there are, yes. Yes,
So,
even though what I share is quite a dramatic example of resilience, then resilience is something that's very much needed in the lives of all of us.
yeah. What you share as a profound and inspiring example of resilience. But before we get to that, I love to get to know my
Okay.
guests more as people, because I mean each of us has major events in our lives that can sometimes define us. Like I had a birth injury, but we are so much more than just that one event and what has followed.
Absolutely.
So when you were let's say 7 or 8, what were you doing at that time?
When I was 7 or 8, I would have been in what we would call here in primary school, and I always have a little bit of a struggle trying to compare this side of the pond here in the UK with yourselves over there in the States. So, what we would call primary, I believe, is probably what you would call elementary.
Yeah.
Yeah, and quite a shy child at that, at Red Scope Junior and Infant School, and along with my younger sister Claire, who also attended the same school.
You said you were shy.
Very much so, yes. And people find that hard to believe, but for someone that shares the story that we will, I'm sure, be touching on today,
Oh
with
yeah.
such huge audiences internationally, people find it hard to think that I was that schoolboy that couldn't really hold a one-to-one conversation without blushing and getting embarrassed.
So how did you move through what was your journey with shyness like?
At school, I didn't particularly find it much of an obstacle because I was really focused on my schoolwork. Not that I ever came out of it a big academic or anything like that, but I was really a conscientious student. And I think it was when it came to going from school to college and then beyond college to actually getting my first job that I realised what a barrier that shyness would be when it came to things like job interviews and actually needing to sell myself. That was the time when I realised that I really did need to start overcoming that shyness as I made that transformation from adolescence to adulthood, as it were, and into the big wide world.
So what were your breakthroughs in overcoming the shyness?
I think something that I actually touch on within my resilience talks, it is finding that big enough why. So the molehill was the fact that I was just a shy person, and I'd sort of told myself, it's just how I am. However, if I realised that I wanted to start going into the world of employment and gaining a job and in time finding a wife and starting a family, then the shyness was something that I really did need to overcome. So it was about finding a why that was big enough than the challenge I was facing with shyness.
So and the why was moving forward in life.
It was, yes, that's correct.
And then you what was your first job outside of college?
My first job after college was to go into IT, and my own daughter Tash, who is now 24 years of age, often will say to me, "Dad, are you sure you went into IT?" The reason being that now technology is very much about fourth generation languages and apps and coding and one thing and another. Whereas when I started out, I was a COBOL programmer on a mainstream computer, and that may well sound to a lot of your audience like it's either a museum piece or a foreign language that I'm speaking. But back in the day when I first took my IT job on, then that's what I was, a COBOL programmer on a mainframe computer. So worlds apart from the coding, etc., the apps that IT is made up of for these days. And that job I actually stayed in for over 12 years.
So when you say a mainframe, can you hear that on your end? Does my voice come through clear on your end, or do you hear feedback?
I'm hearing you loud and clear, Jason.
Okay. I've always been curious but I've never done the research. How big were the mainframe computers back in the day?
Well, to use a UK analogy, if ever you've watched the James Bond films with the big rooms full of what was then all high tech, then that is very much how my first working environment looked. And I think the interesting thing is, as technology moves forward, there's probably more memory now and more processing power in a calculator, let alone your mobile phone, than there were in those machine rooms back then, as we called them.
It's amazing how things have changed in terms of yeah, how like we're talking across the pond using what's everyday technology now. It's just amazing. So
Yeah, in a way, it's interesting how things have actually moved on when we go back to that sort of COBOL programming on a mainframe computer to, as you say, now having the technology to be able to have a live conversation here on opposite sides of the pond. And yet some things have stayed the same. I know when I was growing up, my as I mentioned I was shy, so my best friend was my Sinclair Spectrum that was in my bedroom back then. And the reason I say things don't change much in some things is that back then the whole debate was is it Team Spectrum or is it Team Commodore 64? And when you fast forward now all these decades, the whole debate is still there. Whereas now it's is it laptop or is it Mac? So it's the same argument is there. It's just the technology behind it is different and much improved.
it's true. Was Sinclair a British computer company?
They were indeed, yes, founded by Sir Clive Sinclair, who passed away over the last year, I believe.
Oh wow. So 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 um so then after you were doing computer programming for, did you say 12 years?
That's correct, yes.
How did you decide to make a career change? What was that career change?
Great question again. And I think during the 12 years of working in IT, I had really developed my confidence and realised I was, after all, something of a people person. So I jokingly described the end of my IT career as me deciding that I no longer wanted to stare at a blank screen with a matching expression and do something that was more people centered. And I had a look at what was out there and decided that I would leave the security blanket, the financial security blanket of a very well paid IT job, and go into the realms of self employment within hospitality, what we over here in the UK would describe as a bar manager position, or rather what you would probably describe over that side of the pond as a bar manager position, what we would describe here as a pub landlord. And that is a position that I stayed in various different pubs and bars for over 13 years. So very much a vast change from the computer programming IT background to being in a hospitality management position.
So in these pubs, it's not working. So in these pubs, someone else owns the pub, but you're self-employed as a manager.
You know, we could probably do a whole episode on the structures of how things are, but on the whole, yes, it usually works that someone owns the property, the actual building of the pub, and you are self-employed as a person who actually runs the business within that building. Is probably the best way I can explain it to a universal audience.
So what would you say your purpose was during this time period when you ran the pub?
How was it doing?
What?
I have to say that as will become apparent when we move on to my story, that we probably didn't pick the right time to move into hospitality, because the hospitality trade within the UK has been in decline for a long while, and that was even prior to COVID taking hold and really having an impact upon it. And for that reason, I would say, whilst I do even now encourage the young people to follow their hearts, I would say at the same time do protect against the downside. At the same time, as for me, it was very much a heart-led decision to move into hospitality. Although from a financial point of view, moving away from that financial security of the IT job where I was an employee into being self-employed in hospitality wasn't my smartest ever move.
So you really took a huge step out to to work in the pub, and where some decisions they go really amazing and some don't go as amazing.
Absolutely that, yes. I mean, by all means, be heart-led, but do make sure that head and heart, to a degree, are in sync. Would be my advice from learning from that experience.
So then, were you working at a pub on a on a when you were attacked?
I was indeed, yes. It was on the 9th of June 2013. I'd just worked a long shift in the pub on my own, and the other thing to make clear as well is that the pub wasn't just our workplace, because it was a live-in position. Then the pub, as well as being work, was also home. We actually lived in the flat above the pub.
So what happened on that particular evening?
It had been a particularly uneventful day. Everything had gone fine, no signs of trouble, no reason for security to be heightened or anything. I had taken our beloved family dog, Jasper, for his end of evening walk, having locked up the pub for the evening. And then as we walked back to the pub, we got to the last corner before where the pub was located, and there were three masked individuals lying in wait with baseball bats who severely attacked us. And I'll leave to the imagination of your audience what happened next, as the chances are whatever's been imagined is probably not as graphic as what actually happened. Suffice to say to anyone watching this live or on the recording, I genuinely hope that you never find yourself in a situation where you're laying in the road, hearing the sound of your own bones break each time you swallow, tasting your own blood. And that was the severity of the attack that I experienced on the 9th of June 2013, leaving me with lifelong disabilities. You may just be able to see the crutches in the background, and meaning that an end was put to not only my hospitality management career, but also life as I knew it.
So this was an extremely tragic, violent event. What happened next?
From there, I was taken by ambulance to the local hospital emergency department, where I overheard a very well spoken trauma consultant addressing my wife, Claire, totally unaware that the effects of the ketamine had worn off. And I was hearing every single word second hand as he told her that she really needed to prepare for the worst, and he really did mean the very worst, that if I did happen to make it through the night, I was going to be with them for months, and there was very little chance of saving my right lower leg. So that was the start of over a 3-month stay in hospital, and most of that in isolation, because in addition to the completely shattered fib and tib, the titanium floor, which still holds my eye in place to this day, the type 2 diabetes, the sleep apnea that I developed as a direct result of the attack, as though all those things weren't enough to be dealing with. Within just 1 week of being in that hospital, I also contracted MRSA as well. And that was the reason that most of that stay was in isolation. I was actually discharged from hospital on the 18th of September that same year, so just over 3 months further on, which was one heck of a 3 months, because that was 3 months where I needed to find the resilience to deal with the loneliness and isolation between visiting times, and particularly overnight. I needed to find the resilience to get through 6 operations in that 3-month period, each of them over 12 hours in length. And I needed to find the resilience to deal with the mental health challenges of waking up in the morning, having written a completely different script of 3 different people who I thought the attackers were, a different 4th person who I thought had paid them to attack me, and a different motive in my head where I'd convinced myself was a genuine reason where people would want to see me dead. And I can only say, if there's one thing that is worse for your mental health than 3 people actually trying to take your life, it is when in your head you amplify that to nearly 60 people with 15 different motives all over a a 2 week or so period. At that point, you really have to decide. The police will either catch someone or they won't, but either way, you need to draw a line under it and move on with your life. So that was the incident there. That's how my following 3 months looked. And then from
So
September,
during those 3 months, could you see your kids or your wife at all?
I was allowed to see them during visiting time, so long as they were made aware of the risk they were at and that they'd signed disclaimers, etc. And the other thing during that 3 months is that anyone who entered my room had to wear a yellow apron because yellow was the sign of infection. And even when I had to be moved from that isolated room down for an x-ray or anything, I had to have yellow aprons tied to the bed, which at that time actually felt like the modern day equivalent of the leper bell, the leper bell, letting everyone in your path know that you were contagious, and that again was not particularly edifying or glamorous, Jason, if I'm honest with you.
So how do you deal with these constant thoughts of your attackers and motives and different people involved? Like you had hours upon hours just to think and think and think. How like how did you stop that did you stop that train of thought at some point?
I did, and very early on, probably within the first couple of weeks. I mean, I hand on heart never wanted revenge, but in the early stages was very keen on getting justice and seeing the attackers brought to justice, which, out of interest, just to let you know, that to this very day they've never been identified, let alone brought to justice. So the three of them are still out there somewhere. However, I realised that I needed to take my focus away from that because that wasn't serving anyone, and by letting them occupy space in my mind, I effectively was letting them win and choosing to be in the victim mindset. So I took the focus off of that onto myself and getting well for myself and also for my wife Claire and then 15-year-old daughter Tash. And it's funny because one of the things I often talk about within my talk is something that goes through my head, and I'm not going to say who said this just to make it a fit, but I'd heard something in the past that people will do more for others than they will do for themselves. So I took the focus off being a victim myself and wondering whether they'll ever catch them and what have I done to deserve this, and literally put my focus onto Claire, who was my rock through the difficult times, and also onto Tash, who was studying for her school leaver exams at the time that all this was going on, not knowing whether her dad would survive or not.
So, so in a way, taking your focus away from why me and putting it on your family and eventually on how you could help so many other people in a way that played a huge part in your healing, huh?
It very much did, and as I mentioned initially, it was Claire and Tash that my focus was on, and then beyond that, after quite a lengthy period of recovering to a degree physically and mentally and psychologically, I took the decision that I wanted to turn this from a negative that had happened to me into a positive for as many people as possible, as you so eloquently touched on in your introduction today. And initially, I had intended that I would be able to help other trauma survivors, as I felt that that was where the empathy would really be. And whilst I still today really do enjoy working with trauma survivors when the opportunity comes up, I quite often find that people are still in need of the mental health professionals, of the psychiatrists and the clinical psychologists, etc., of which I claim to be neither. I'm just someone with an empathic listening ear. And it was suggested to me that rather than focusing primarily on trauma survivors, that I start sharing my story with students at round about the 11 plus kind of age, with a view to using my story to be something which is preemptive rather than reactive, based on the old adage that prevention is better than cure. And even though I am very much about resilience, the theme that's obviously going to keep recurring through this whole interview, the idea of sharing my story from a place of vulnerability in front of a class of 30 pairs of 11-year-old eyes really did fill me with dread until the first time I'd done it, at which point I walked out of that classroom realizing that that was where I realized I really could make an impact, make a difference, and do something that was preventative rather than curing to young people of that age and upwards.
How did that first group of kids respond when you told your story?
They really were absolutely amazing. As we're aware, 11-year-olds can be quite active and have quite a short attention span. And for the whole of the sharing of my talk, they were literally sat in stony silence on the edge of the seat, sort of absorbing every word. And I think to a degree, you could actually almost see the realization on their faces that when they play computer games like Fortnite or whatever the game of the moment is, which is a bloodthirsty game, comparing that to the real life experience of someone undergoing a violent attack as I did, they suddenly realise that that's not the same thing whatsoever. And the questions that came from the young people were some really powerful questions indeed, and continue to be to this day. In fact, I would say, as we're coming out of COVID now, thankfully at long last, the questions from the young people that I'm receiving now are probably even deeper than the ones I was receiving before COVID.
What types of questions do they typically ask?
Yeah, whereas before they were all to do with elements of the story and wanting sort of more the drama side of it. I mean, a couple from recent groups that have really stuck with me is one student asked me, how has what you've gone through vicariously impacted upon the mental health of your daughter?
Oh, wow.
And another question I got even more recently was, as a result of what has happened to you, has that made you an overprotective parent? And if so, has that driven a wedge between yourself and your daughter and impacted the dynamic of that parent-child relationship? Those are the kinds of the questions I'm receiving these days.
Wow. Wow. So the first question was what? What again?
The first question was, how has what happened to me impacted upon the mental health of my daughter as a result of her undergoing vicarious trauma?
And what was the answer to that?
It really did affect her. I mean, as a 15-year-old that's undergoing your school leaver exams at the time, not knowing whether your dad's going to live or not, then it is quite possible that you could be asking yourself, as most 15-year-olds would be, what is the importance of exams in the grand scheme of things when I don't know whether my dad's going to live or not? But Tasha's outlook was extremely different, and she decided she was going to do her very best under the circumstances to add her exam results to the ever-growing long list of things I'm so proud of her for. And I'm able to sit before you today as one proud dad and share with you that she left school with no less than 11 GCSE school leaver exams at grade B and above, which is how they were graded back then. And I know that may not mean a lot to an international audience. So to give perspective, that was roughly treble the average results of that academic year.
So she felt the anxiety, of course, about you being so in such bad shape, but she also focused on the work at hand and did amazingly well.
Indeed, she did. Yes, I guess you could say she found her own way of turning that negative that had happened into a positive.
Wow. And how about has this experience made you like a more protective parent?
I would say it did, in all honesty, yes. And maybe that did cost her the freedom that her peers had, where they'd be allowed to do certain things. And I guess at the back of my mind, I was thinking, it's bad enough what's happened to me, but if it was to happen to my daughter, however would I cope with that? And realistically, it wasn't something that was likely to happen. I mean, the police had said that for whatever the reason was when I was attacked, I was the target of that attack. It wasn't a random attack. I wasn't the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time or anything like that. That it was a targeted attack, and obviously because the three assailants have never been identified, let alone brought to justice, we don't know what that motive is. So I would say yes, it did make me something of an overprotective parent, and therefore I did probably wrap Tash in cotton wool more than was healthy to do so at that time. Yet now, years on, I would say we're absolutely as well as being father and daughter, we are the best of friends as well.
That's beautiful. That that's beautiful. And I sense such a deep love in you wanting to protect and of course just this deep love.
It absolutely is, yes.
So when you think about that evening in 2013 and think about taking your dog out on that walk, would you have done anything different in retrospect?
From a personal point of view, then with the benefit of hindsight, if I had to go through the same thing again to have the opportunities to make a positive difference in the life of young people that I have done since, then from my own point of view, I would go through the whole thing again, because my life purpose prior to that attack was about serving beer and snacks to people over the bar, whereas now my life purpose is about sharing this story and helping people raise their resilience, their self-esteem, and their aspirations in a way that is frequently life changing in a positive way, and on occasion has been life saving by me sharing this story from such a place of vulnerability and giving other people hope and letting them see how you can come out of it the other side improved as a result of the adversity. So from my own point of view, I wouldn't change a thing. At the same time, if I had a choice, I wouldn't put my wife and daughter and those close to me through what they went through vicariously as a result of what I endured.
This is almost mind-boggling though, because on a personal level, you would go through the pain of the attack, the pain of those 3 months of isolation and not knowing if you would survive, and then the healing beyond that, and 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 still using crutches today.
I
You would
absolutely
go
would.
through that for the expanded purpose you
In the
have
blink of an
now.
eye.
In a blink of an eye.
Yes.
So what would you say to there's so many people who are struggling to find a purpose in life that really makes them step out and step up and endure really tough things. What would you say to all these people, like including me at times, who are struggling to find sufficient purpose to draw us forward into life as fully as we're capable of being in life? Does that make sense?
It does indeed, yes. I think one of the things that seems to be a recurring theme for me is that finding a big enough why. So choose how big the adversities are. Your reason why is bigger than that. I would say that gratitude comes into it as well. Always being grateful and looking for that silver lining in every cloud, which hopefully this story has been something of an example of. As you know, it's one of those things where it's a proven fact that you can't be grateful and down at the same time, and
You can be grateful and down,
that you can't be. No,
or you can't.
no, probably something lost in the accent there, Jason.
So how do you use gratitude during those first 3 months of recovery?
I would say not during that stage. Those first 3 months were a very dark time for me indeed. And I think if someone had told me then, "Oh, you need to be grateful," my view would have been what for. But I always talk about the difference in experience and wisdom. And I think the fact that I've experienced how I was feeling at that time, had I had the wisdom of gratitude back then, I could have applied it then. So to save other people going through their own equivalent of that 3 months, I would rather them call on my wisdom and think, find the things to be grateful for. I mean, yes, I'm an attempted murder survivor. Yes, it was a brutal attack, and I still say that is one of the best things ever to happen to me in life. And the reason that I say it's one of the best things is I have a wife of 28 years and a daughter who's coming up to 25. So if I was to say that that attack was the best thing ever to happen to me, it may well be a test of my own resilience. However, it is one of the best things, as we talked about a few minutes ago, in that it has given me a much more significant life purpose than I had before.
As a resilience coach, what struggles do people commonly come to you with?
Well, quite often the work we do is in the classroom anyway, so it's not always that they come forward with it. So it's a lot of it is more about helping them to have that mindset, because obviously out of a class of 30 students, it may well be that they have things that they don't want to openly talk about. So by giving them the tools without knowing what their issue is, that's putting them in a situation where they can start addressing that. At the same time, we do often have people who do share things with us. I'll just give you one example of that. It was a young man who was still in what we would call primary, you would call elementary school, probably round about 10 years of age, is what back in my school days we would have referred to as the cock of the school, the one that nobody could beat in a fight. And sadly, even in today's society, amongst young people, that is still something of a yardstick. He was on the verge of permanent permanent exclusion when I worked with them, and from me going into that classroom, he wouldn't make eye contact. His arms were folded, his eyes were anywhere but making eye contact, and it was pretty clear from his body language that he wasn't going to engage with anything I did. But I included him with the rest of the class. We got to the end of me sharing my story and asked for questions, answers, and comments as I normally do. And Declan, as I call him, it wasn't his name, but that's what I call him for safeguarding purposes. He raised his hand, and because I'd come to school and shared with them from a place of vulnerability, he at that point shared that until he was adopted at just 18 months old, he'd been so badly physically abused, he was left with permanent brain damage, and that was why he was like he was with his peers. And then, given that the area the school was in was a low demographic area where sadly the belief still exists that boys don't cry, having found the strength and the resilience to disclose that to the whole of his class, Declan then grabbed a box of tissues off his teacher's desk and shed the whole 8.5 years worth of tears pent up inside him in front of all 29 of his classmates. So that is probably the most poignant example I can share with you when you ask me about what kind of things the young people are going through. That's the one that I, to this day, find most significant.
Wow. Think of what a big deal in his life that was to finally break through his silence and be able to put words to the trauma that had happened in his life.
Yeah, I mean, from a safeguarding point of view, I did check with the school that they were aware of this, and it turned out that the school were aware of it because he was considered a looked after child, and also he had shared this with his best friend previously, but none of his other peers had any idea about this. So for Declan, that was absolutely massive, and he did go from being on the verge of permanent exclusion to being an almost model student for the rest of that school year.
Well, wow. So your story catalyzed something within him, and once he opened up, he was able to change
Very
his
much so.
approach to school.
That's right.
One thing you mentioned when we talked before, by the way, our friends Jenny Gold and Tim say hi, which is awesome.
Hi, Jenny. Hi, Tim. Thank you both.
So, so you talked about when we spoke before. You talked about the concept of post traumatic growth.
Yeah, that is
How
something
would
that,
you define what is that idea about?
yeah, I couldn't give you the psychologist textbook definition of it or anything. For me, my interpretation of post-traumatic growth is the fact that I feel I'm a stronger, more resilient, and more positive person as a result of going through that hardship than I was before the attack occurred.
What would you say to someone who's listening who feels that who just feels they're really struggling in life right now and no matter what they do, like nothing's working out and
Yeah, I think in addition to what we talked about with the gratitude piece and the finding a big enough why, I think the other things to look at are just look at reframing things. Imagine how they can do things differently would be another piece of advice I would give to people. I mean, when I used to share my story before COVID, I used to talk about the fact that I was a qualified deep water scuba diver. So long as I had the safety of a dive buddy with me, I could dive up to 30 meters anywhere in the world. And as a result of the attack and all the ailments I listed earlier in this talk that we're having today, I feel that would be too much of a responsibility to put on my dive buddy. So rather than focusing on what I couldn't do on the scuba diving side of things, I focused on what I could do and put that same enthusiasm into snorkeling. And again, once I'm in the water in a pair of fins and a snorkel and everything, I look exactly the same as everyone else. I don't need the crutches to be able to snorkel in the water and everything. So that's the example I used to use. However, looking at how adaptable we've all had to be during the COVID and the lockdown period, if I'd have said to people 3 years ago that your working life, your social life, in fact, your entire life is going to be performed virtually on little 1 inch screens with yellow boxes around people's heads, they would have thought I'd been overindulging in the beers or something that I was serving. Whereas, that's exactly how society has been for a couple of years, and that's for me. That now means I don't really have to labour the point about being adaptable. I think that has sort of really highlighted to all of us how society can change when it needs to and adapt.
the capacity us humans have to be resilient is truly there's truly so much hope in that.
There really is. Yeah, thank you.
Well, before we go, what was the experience of giving your TED Talk like?
It was a unique experience, actually, the TED Talk, and I feel almost like a fraud when people say to me, "Oh, right, tell us about your TED Talk because I want to go on YouTube and look it up." Sadly, it's not there. It can't be found, but it really did happen. And what happened was I was invited by a university in Spain
Wow.
to deliver my TEDx talk virtually as part of a virtual TEDx event they were running at the height of the pandemic and the international lockdowns. And unfortunately, due to a technical hitch, none of the TEDx talks that were delivered on that day were recorded. So it really did happen. It did qualify as a TEDx talk. but sadly I'm unable to prove that it happened. So I am still looking for my moment of standing on the red dot with the big red letters at the back of me. So if anyone listening is looking for someone to speak on the subject of resilience or mental health or crime prevention that has heard a little bit of my talk today or feels it would be a fit, then do get in touch, because it's still my burning desire to actually deliver my TEDx talk again from a physical stage next time.
And now you, I mean, you practice. You like literally been part of a TEDx event. You had to prepare. You've had to do everything. So now you're primed to stand on that red dot.
Yeah, even
I
to the
have
degree of
vi-
keeping my eye on that timer to make sure it didn't go a second beyond the allowed 18 minutes.
I have visions of you standing on that dot somewhere major, like in London and in Paris or Berlin or something, and really inviting people to think of how they can use that energy to move forward instead of being stuck in victimhood. Oh, so if you ever ran into your three assailants, like say at a coffee shop, what were you? And they were just drinking coffee, and you were drinking coffee, and what would you want to say to them?
That's a question that I quite often get asked in a slightly less diplomatic way by classes of 11-year-olds who will normally say to me, "Sir, if you came across those three people, would you punch them in the face?" At which point I'm always very quick to reply, "No, because as we're aware, violence is never the answer." And then I surprise them by saying, "So long as I didn't feel that those three people were still a threat to others, my reaction would actually be to shake them by the hand and thank them for the positive difference they've made in my life by giving me that life purpose of being able to get out there in front of young people and change their lives in a positive way. And as I mentioned, on occasion, even save lives. Then without that attack, I wouldn't have been given that opportunity. And for that reason, I would shake them by the hand and thank them for that."
Well, goosebumps. So I talked about what doing my imperfect best means to me at the beginning of the podcast. What does doing your imperfect best mean to you?
I think my imperfect best means practicing what I preach and having the resilience to go out there, to step out of my comfort zone, hence the very first classroom I went into. And if you get it wrong, don't see it as a failure, just see it as another step towards getting it right next time.
Hmm.
Learn the lessons from what went wrong. See every mistake as a learning opportunity, and then forget that you got it wrong. Just apply the lesson that you learned from that mistake moving forward. And for me, that is what my imperfect perfection would look like.
I love the idea of applying the lesson and forgetting all the feelings about getting it wrong, forgetting the guilt, the shame, the frustration. Just apply the lesson and move forward.
Absolutely.
That's brilliant. Any final words you how should the people reach out to you?
Yeah, if people want to reach out to me, the best way is probably via my email address, which is roger@survivestrivethrive.co.uk. And again, I know that is something of a mouthful, but as you touched on again in your introduction, it really does say what it does on the tin. The Survive is about us meeting the young people with where they're at with their adversities at the moment, whether that is as a result of crime, whether it's mental health challenges, whether it's bereavement, whatever it may be. The Strive is about working hard with the young people, not getting them to do all the hard work on their own, but not doing it for them, because life does require hard work to move forward. So we want them to realize early on that there is no magic pill or golden button, or that crime is not the shortcut to a successful life. So that's where the strive comes in. And then the thrive is getting them to realize that they usually are more capable of much more than they have come to believe they are. I mean, one of the examples that we're getting again a lot more since we're coming out of COVID lockdowns is young people are saying to us things like, I'll never be anything more than a shelf stacker or a cleaner because that's all I'm worth. And at that point, we'll say to them, look, there is nothing wrong with either of those jobs if they are the job that you choose to do. In fact, during COVID, those very professions were the unsung hero that would have been in a much bigger mess without. However, don't go into those lines of work just because you've told yourself that you're not worthy of anything more than that, and convince yourself of it and start to believe in it. So that's how the name came about. As much of a mouthful as it is, it sums up exactly what it does on the tin, and it's the order it comes in: the survive, strive, thrive.
What again? Survive,
Dot co
strive,
dot, dot co dot uk, with us being UK
dot,
based.
.co.uk.
That's correct, yes.
So .co.uk. Just one second.
And I'm also on LinkedIn personally as Roger Cheetham. I'm quite happy for anyone to connect with me there as well.
He just lost that time. I don't know how to spell survive. Getting it here. Co. Okay, is this it?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Oh wow! What?
You just beat me to it. I just put it in the chat for you as well, so you could cut and paste it if you wanted to. But you got there before I did.
Nice. Thanks so much for being on the journey you're on and determining to make the best of a really horrendous situation, not only for yourself, but your wife and your daughter, but not only for them, but for thousands of people. The work you're doing is rippling out and out and out. Thanks for being you, Roger.
It's been my absolute honour, and thank you for the opportunity to share this with your global audience, Jason. Thank you.
Well, Roger has such just a brilliant message of reminding me and reminding all of us of how I'm walking away from this asking myself, how can I be even more resilient when life throws me things that I didn't plan for and don't want? And it's a powerful story. Thanks for your time in tuning in, and tune in for another great guest next week. Bye for now.